The gunshot that killed Catherine's husband echoed through the Sacramento Valley for 3 seconds before silence swallowed everything whole. And in that silence, she learned that grief doesn't announce itself with tears, but with the sudden understanding that tomorrow would arrive whether she was ready or not. She stood in the doorway of their small ranch house outside Placerville, California, watching the sheriff and his deputy ride away with Thomas's body wrapped in canvas, leaving her with nothing but 40 acres of drought-cracked earth, a barn full of hungry cattle, and a heart that felt like shattered glass grinding against her ribs. It was July 1872, and the summer heat pressed down on everything like God's own iron, turning the grass to straw and the creek to dust. Catherine Whitmore was 24 years old, and she had been married for exactly 4 years and 7 months when a claim jumper's bullet found Thomas while he was riding the fence line on their eastern border. The man who shot him was dead too, killed by Thomas's return fire, so there was no one to hate, no one to blame, just 2 bodies and 2 widows and the earth that kept spinning like none of it mattered at all. The other widow lived somewhere in Nevada territory, the sheriff said, and Catherine thought about her sometimes in those first raw days, wondered if she too stood at her window watching the sun rise and set with mechanical indifference, wondered if she too felt like the world should have stopped. The neighbors came with casseroles and condolences, their words washing over her like creek water, meaningless and cold. Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile held her hands and said time heals all wounds, but Catherine wanted to ask her if time could birth a calf or mend a fence, or keep the bank from foreclosing when she couldn't make the next payment. Mr. Peterson, who owned the feed store, offered to buy her out for half what the land was worth, his eyes already calculating profit margins while Thomas wasn't even cold in the ground. She sent them all away with tight smiles and tighter words, and when the last wagon rolled down her drive, she walked out to the barn and finally let herself cry, great heaving sobs that scared the cattle and made her ribs ache. But crying didn't fix anything. Crying didn't water the stock or repair the broken windmill or negotiate with the bank. So Catherine dried her eyes, braided her dark hair into a severe knot at the base of her neck, and set about learning how to survive. She had grown up on a farm in Missouri, knew the basics of animal husbandry and crop rotation, but Thomas had always handled the heavy work, the dangerous work, the work that required strength she wasn't sure she possessed. Still, the earth wouldn't stop spinning just because she was scared. 3 weeks after the funeral, the windmill that pumped water from the well finally gave up its ghost with a screech of protesting metal. Catherine stood looking up at it, shading her eyes against the August sun, trying to figure out how one person could climb up there and fix something that had taken Thomas and 2 hired hands a full day to install. The cattle were lowing in their pen, thirsty and restless, and the water barrels were already half empty. She had maybe 2 days before things got desperate. She was still standing there, paralyzed by indecision and exhaustion, when she heard the sound of hooves on the packed dirt drive. Catherine turned to see a man riding toward her on a paint horse, leading a pack mule behind him. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty trail coat and a hat pulled low against the sun. Something about the way he sat his horse spoke of long miles and hard country, and Catherine felt her hand drift instinctively to the rifle she'd started carrying everywhere. The rider stopped a respectful distance away and tipped his hat. "Madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried easily across the space between them. "I'm looking for Thomas Whitmore. Heard he might have worked for a man who knows his way around cattle." Catherine's throat closed up for a moment. "Thomas is dead," she said, forcing the words out flat and hard. "Killed 3 weeks back." The man went very still. Then he removed his hat entirely, revealing sun-bronzed features and dark hair that needed cutting. His eyes were a startling gray-green, like sage after rain. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam. Thomas and I rode together down in Arizona territory back in '68. He was a good man." "You knew him," Catherine heard the hunger in her own voice, the desperate need to hear about Thomas from someone who remembered him alive and vital. "Yes, madam." "My name's Yates Quinn." Thomas and I worked a drive from Tucson to Denver that year. Hard trail, bad weather, but he never complained. Talked about his pretty wife back in California the whole way. I expect that was you. Catherine felt something crack inside her chest, not quite breaking but shifting like ice at the start of spring. He talked about me, every night by the fire, said he was saving up to buy you a proper ranch, someplace with good water and better grass. Looks like he did it too. Yates gestured at the land around them, though his eyes caught on the broken windmill and the thirsty cattle, for all the good it does me now. The bitterness in her voice surprised even Catherine. I can't fix that windmill, can't do half the things that need doing. Bank's going to take this place before winter, and Thomas's dream dies with him. Yates was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those strange light eyes. What if it didn't have to? What? Die? The dream? He resettled his hat on his head. I came looking for work. You've got work needs doing. Seems like we might could help each other. Catherine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I can't pay you, I can barely feed myself. Room and board's payment enough until you get back on your feet. After that, we can work out wages. Why would you do that? You don't know me. No, madam, but I knew Thomas, and he'd haunt me from here to eternity if I rode away and let his widow lose everything he built. Yates shifted in his saddle. Besides, I've been drifting for 4 years now. Might be nice to stay in one place for a spell. Catherine wanted to say yes. The word was right there on her tongue, desperate and grateful, but she'd been raised to be cautious, and a young widow taking on a strange man as a hired hand would set every tongue in Placerville wagging. People will talk, she said quietly. People always talk. Question is whether you care more about their talking or about keeping your home. She looked at the windmill, then at the thirsty cattle, then back at Yates Quinn sitting patient and still on his paint horse. The earth wouldn't stop spinning. Thomas wasn't coming back. And pride didn't water stock or mend fences. Can you fix that windmill? She asked. Yes, madam. There's a bunkhouse out back. It's not much, but it's got a stove and a bed. You can stable your animals in the barn. Breakfast is at dawn, supper at sunset, and I expect a full day's work in between. Yates's face didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. Yes, madam, you'll get it. That was how Yates Quinn came to stay at the Whitmore ranch, and how Catherine began learning that survival sometimes meant accepting help even when every instinct said to handle things alone. He fixed the windmill that first afternoon, climbing the tower with the easy confidence of a man who'd never met a height that scared him. Catherine watched from below, ready to run for the doctor in town if he fell. But he moved like he was born 30 feet in the air, his hands sure and steady on the metal framework. When he climbed down, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands were bleeding from half a dozen small cuts, but the windmill was spinning again, its blades cutting the air with rhythmic precision. The pump groaned to life, and water began flowing into the trough. The cattle crowded around it, drinking deeply, and Catherine felt something in her chest ease just slightly. Thank you, she said, and meant it more than any thanks she'd ever given. Yates just nodded and went to see about his horse. They fell into a routine over the following weeks. Yates was up before dawn every morning, already doing chores by the time Catherine made breakfast. He was a man of few words, communicating mostly in nods and brief sentences, but his work spoke volumes. He fixed the fence line where Thomas had died, buried posts deep and strung wire tight. He reshoed the horses and mucked out the barn and rode out each day to check on the cattle scattered across the 40 acres. He found 3 calves tangled in blackberry brambles and freed them without getting kicked. He spotted a mountain lion stalking the herd and scared it off with warning shots. He did the work of 2 men and never once complained. Catherine, for her part, tried to maintain the boundaries appropriate to a widow and her hired hand. She cooked his meals but served them separately, eating at the kitchen table while he ate on the bunkhouse porch. She washed his work clothes but left them folded on the fence rail for him to collect. She spoke to him only about ranch business, keeping her voice cool and professional. The people of Placerville were already talking. She could see it in the way Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed at the mercantile, in the way Reverend Matthews asked pointed questions about whether she had family she could stay with. She wouldn't give them anything more to gossip about, But despite her best efforts, she found herself noticing things about Yates Quinn. The way he was gentle with the animals, talking to the horses in a low murmur that settled them when they were spooked. The way he always hung his hat on the same nail in the barn, creating order in small things. The way he sometimes stood looking west toward the Sierra Nevada, his face unreadable, like he was seeing something beyond the mountains that only he could perceive. She noticed that he never went to town, never drank, never gambled. She noticed the old scars on his hands and forearms, the marks of a hard life written in white lines across bronze skin. She noticed that he was probably 30 or 31, still young despite the weathered quality that came from years in the saddle. She tried not to notice. Tried to see him only as a hired hand, a means to an end, a temporary solution to an impossible problem. But the Earth kept spinning, and each day brought them into closer orbit. September came with cooler temperatures and the first hint of autumn in the air. The cattle were fat and healthy, the fences were sound, and the ranch looked better than it had in years. Yates had even painted the barn, spending his Sundays on a ladder with a brush, turning weathered gray wood into a respectable red. Catherine had protested that it wasn't necessary, but he just shrugged and said if he was going to look at something every day, it might as well be pleasant to look at. One evening in mid-September, as the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold, Catherine brought Yates his supper on the bunkhouse porch as usual. But instead of retreating immediately, she found herself pausing, looking out at the land painted in sunset colors. "It's beautiful," she said without thinking. Yates looked up from the plate she'd handed him, following her gaze. "Yes, madam, Thomas knew how to pick land." "He did." She was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes, madam. Why did you really come here?" The truth, not just the story about owing Thomas. Yates set down his fork, considering. "I was tired," he said finally. "Tired of drifting, tired of never knowing where I'd sleep or when I'd eat next, tired of not mattering to anybody." Thomas used to talk about how good it felt to build something, to have a place that was his. I guess I wanted to see if that feeling was real. And is it? I don't know yet. This isn't my place to build. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You've done more for this ranch in 6 weeks than I could have done in 6 years. It feels like yours as much as mine at this point. It's your name on the deed, madam. I'm just passing through. What if you didn't have to be?" The words were out before she could stop them, and Catherine immediately wanted to take them back. But Yates was looking at her now with an intensity that made her breath catch, those sage-colored eyes searching her face. "What are you saying, Mrs. Whitmore?" "I'm saying this ranch needs both of us to survive. I'm saying you could be a partner, not just a hired hand, half shares, legal and proper. People would really talk then. Let them talk. I'm tired of caring what people think." She was surprised to find it was true. "The Earth won't stop spinning because they disapprove." Yates stood up slowly, his supper forgotten. He was tall, she realized, maybe 6 feet or more, and standing this close she could see the flecks of gold in his gray-green eyes. "Then let's spin with it," he said quietly. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went deeper than words. Catherine felt it like an electric current, thrilling and terrifying all at once. She wasn't ready for this, she told herself. Thomas had only been dead 3 months. It was too soon, too fast, too everything. But the Earth kept spinning. "I'll have papers drawn up," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Equal partnership. I don't want your charity, Catherine." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "It's not charity, it's survival, mine and yours both." He studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "All right, partners." They shook hands like men conducting business, but Catherine felt the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his skin, the strength in his fingers, and knew that this was something more than business. She pulled away first, suddenly flustered, and hurried back to the house without another word. That night, lying in the bed she'd shared with Thomas, Catherine stared at the ceiling and tried to sort out her feelings. She had loved Thomas, loved him truly and deeply. He had been kind and gentle and good. But if she was honest with herself, theirs had been a practical love more than a passionate one. They had been partners in survival, building a life together through hard work and mutual respect. She had mourned him genuinely and still felt the ache of his absence in quiet moments. But Yates made her feel something different, something she wasn't sure she'd ever felt before. When he looked at her, she felt seen in a way that was both frightening and exhilarating. When he spoke, she found herself leaning in to catch every word. When he worked, she caught herself watching the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt, the way sweat gleamed on his neck, the way he smiled at the horses when he thought no one was looking. She was falling for him, she realized with a start, falling hard and fast like rain in the desert. And she had no idea if he felt the same, or if she was just a widow he'd taken pity on, a debt to a dead friend he was determined to pay. The next morning, Catherine rode into Placerville to see the lawyer, a pinch-faced man named Aldridge who had handled Thomas's will. She explained what she wanted, and Aldridge's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. A partnership with your hired hand, Mrs. Whitmore, that's highly irregular. Irregular or not, it's what I want. Can you draw up the papers, or do I need to find another lawyer? Aldridge sniffed but agreed, and told her to come back in 3 days. Catherine stopped at the Mercantile on her way out of town, enduring Mrs. Henderson's pointed questions about the handsome cowboy who'd been spotted working her ranch. She bought flour and coffee and sugar, and tried to ignore the way conversations stopped when she walked past, the way eyes followed her down the street. On her way to the wagon, she ran into Reverend Matthews outside the saloon, where he'd been ministering to men who needed it most, he liked to say. He touched her arm gently, his face full of concern. "Catherine, my dear, how are you managing?" "Well enough, Reverend." "I've been meaning to call on you. I worry about you out there all alone." "I'm not alone, I've hired help." "Yes, I'd heard." His expression grew even more concerned. "Catherine, I say this with Christian love, but people are worried. A young widow living alone with a strange man, it's not proper, it's not safe." Catherine felt anger flare hot in her chest. "What would you have me do, Reverend? Lose the ranch Thomas died for? Starve? Become dependent on the charity of others?" "Of course not, but there are other solutions. You could sell, move into town. There's a room at the boarding house, and I'm sure the Mercantile would hire you, or you could marry again. John Peterson is a good man, and he's been asking after you. John Peterson is 50 years old and already buried 2 wives. He could provide for you. Give you security." Catherine thought of Yates, standing in the sunset, saying, "Let's spin with it." She thought of the way he'd brought Thomas's dream to life without being asked. She thought of how he made her feel alive again when she'd been certain that part of her had died with her husband. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend, but I can provide for myself." She climbed into the wagon and drove away before he could respond, her hands shaking on the reins. The earth wouldn't stop spinning, and she was tired of apologizing for spinning with it. When she got back to the ranch, Yates was working on the corral fence, replacing boards that had rotted through. He looked up as she drove in, and something in her face must have shown because he set down his hammer and walked over. Trouble in town, just people being people. She climbed down from the wagon, and he moved to help her unload supplies without being asked. "The lawyer is drawing up partnership papers. They'll be ready in 3 days. You sure about this, Catherine? Once those papers are signed, you can't take it back without cause." "I'm sure, are you?" He handed her the bag of flour, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Something in the way he said it made her look up sharply, and she found him watching her with an expression that made her heart race. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and she wasn't sure if she wanted him to or if she was terrified that he would. But he just stepped back, giving her space, and returned to unloading the wagon. That evening, Catherine made fried chicken and biscuits, and instead of eating separately, she brought 2 plates to the bunkhouse porch. Yates raised an eyebrow but said nothing, just moved over to make room for her on the step. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "Tell me about Arizona," Catherine said eventually, "when you rode with Thomas." So Yates told her. He told her about the dust storms that turned day into night, about the cattle that stampeded during thunderstorms, about the cook who made coffee so strong it could wake the dead. He told her about Thomas singing off-key around the campfire, about the time he jumped into a river to save a calf and came up covered in mud, about the day they'd reached Denver and Thomas had bought a silver comb to send home to his wife. "I still have that comb," Catherine said softly. "I didn't know where it came from. He just gave it to me one day, said he saw it and thought of me. That was Thomas, always thinking of you. You must have someone who thinks of you like that. A girl somewhere." Yates was quiet for a long time. "No," he said finally. "Never stayed in one place long enough for that. Never wanted to before." And now, he turned to look at her, and in the starlight his eyes were dark and deep. "Now I'm starting to think I might have been wrong about a lot of things." Catherine's breath caught. "Yates, you don't have to say anything. I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving. I just want you to know that I'm not here out of obligation. I'm here because I want to be." She reached out before she could second-guess herself and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and real. They sat like that for a long time, holding hands on the bunkhouse porch while the stars wheeled overhead and the earth spun beneath them. Over the following weeks, something shifted between them. It was nothing dramatic, no grand declarations or stolen kisses, just a gradual dissolution of the walls Catherine had built. She found herself seeking out Yates's company, working beside him in the barn or walking the fence line together in the evening. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from cattle prices to childhood memories to dreams they'd never spoken aloud. Catherine learned that Yates had grown up in Texas, the youngest of 6 children, and had left home at 15 after his parents died of fever. She learned that he'd been a soldier for a year during the war, though he didn't like to talk about it. She learned that he could read and write, unusual for a cowhand, because his mother had been a schoolteacher and believed education was the highest form of love. In turn, she told him about growing up in Missouri, about her father's farm and her mother's flower garden. She told him about meeting Thomas at a church social, about the way he'd courted her with wildflowers and shy smiles. She told him about the miscarriage she'd had 2 years into their marriage, the baby boy who'd come too early and never drawn breath. She told him things she'd never told anyone, and he listened without judgment, his presence a steady anchor in the tumultuous sea of her emotions. October brought the first rains, and with them, a crisis. Catherine woke one morning to find one of their best breeding cows struggling in labor, the calf positioned wrong and neither able to be born alive if someone didn't intervene. She ran for Yates, and together they worked for 3 hours in the mud and rain, Yates with his arm deep inside the cow, carefully turning the calf while Catherine held the animal's head and murmured soothing words. When the calf finally slid free, covered in blood and mucus but breathing, they both collapsed in exhausted relief. "We did it," Catherine said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Oh God, Yates, we did it." He was grinning, his face streaked with mud and worse, his clothes ruined, but his eyes alight with joy. "Yeah, we did." Without thinking, Catherine threw her arms around his neck and hugged him tight. She felt him go still with surprise, then his arms came around her waist, pulling her close. They stayed like that for a long moment, kneeling in the mud beside a newborn calf, holding each other like they were the only 2 people in the world. When Catherine finally pulled back, she saw something in Yates's eyes that made her pulse race. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough. "I need to tell you something." "What?" "I'm falling in love with you. Have been since the day I rode up and saw you standing there in the sun like you were daring the whole world to break you. I know it's too soon. I know you might not feel the same, but I can't keep it in anymore." Catherine couldn't breathe. Her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Yates, you don't have to say anything back. I just needed you to know. I'm falling in love with you too," she blurted out. "And it terrifies me. Thomas has only been dead 5 months. What kind of wife does that make me? The human kind." Yates reached up and cupped her face in his muddy hand. "Catherine, Thomas is gone. I'm sorry he is, but he is. And you're still here, still alive. You're allowed to keep living. The earth won't stop spinning," she whispered. "Then let's spin with it," he said, and kissed her. It was nothing like kissing Thomas had been. This was fire and hunger and need, years of loneliness burning away in the space of a heartbeat. Catherine kissed him back desperately, her fingers tangling in his wet hair, her body pressed against his like she could crawl inside his skin. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for air, she saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. "We're covered in mud," she said breathlessly. "Don't care. The calf needs cleaning. Don't care about that either," she laughed, and it felt like freedom. "We should get inside before we catch our death." They took care of the calf and the cow first, making sure both were safe and warm. Then they stumbled to the house, shedding muddy clothes on the porch. Catherine heated water for baths, and they took turns washing while the other waited in the kitchen, the air between them electric with possibility and promise. When Yates emerged from the washroom in clean clothes, his hair still damp, Catherine was waiting with coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, not speaking, just looking at each other like they were seeing each other for the first time. "What happens now?" Catherine asked finally. "I don't know." "What do you want to happen?" She thought about it carefully. "I want to stop being afraid. I want to stop caring what people think. I want to live my life with someone who makes me feel alive." "I want that too, but I need time, Yates, not a lot, but some. I need to make my peace with moving forward. I can give you time. I've got nowhere else to be." 3 days later, they rode into Placerville together to sign the partnership papers. Aldridge looked disapproving as ever, but the documents were legally sound, making Yates and Catherine equal owners of the ranch and all its assets. They signed on the courthouse steps, witnessed by Aldridge and his clerk, and then they were bound together in business if not yet in marriage. The gossip reached fever pitch after that. Catherine could feel it like a physical thing every time she went to town, the whispers and stares and pointed comments. Mrs. Henderson refused to serve her at the Mercantile, forcing Catherine to take her business to the general store on the edge of town. Reverend Matthews preached a sermon about the sanctity of widowhood and the dangers of moral corruption. John Peterson stopped by the ranch to make one last attempt at courting and left red-faced and angry when Catherine politely declined. "Let them talk," Yates said when Catherine came home upset after a particularly bad trip to town. "They'll find something else to gossip about soon enough. I hate that they're making something ugly out of something good." "Then don't let them. Catherine, we know the truth. We know what we are to each other. That's all that matters." He was right, she realized. The earth would keep spinning whether Placerville approved or not. She could either waste her energy fighting their judgment, or she could put that energy into building the life she wanted. She chose the latter. November brought the partnership papers and a question. Yates asked it one evening as they sat by the fire in the main house, a habit they'd fallen into as the weather grew colder. They were reading or pretending to, but mostly they were just existing in each other's presence, comfortable in the silence. "Catherine," Yates said suddenly, "would you consider marrying me?" She looked up from her book, heart pounding. "Are you asking?" "Not yet. I'm asking if you would consider it. If I asked properly with a ring and a plan and all the things a proposal should have, would you say yes?" Catherine set down her book carefully. 6 months ago, she'd been a grieving widow certain she'd never love again. Now here was this man, this impossible gift, offering her a future she'd been afraid to imagine. "Thomas and I were married in the spring," she said slowly. "April 18th, 1868. If you asked me come spring, after a year of widowhood, I think I could say yes with a clear conscience." Yates smiled, slow and warm. "Then I'll ask you in the spring. You sound very confident of my answer." "I am." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. "Because you love me, and I love you, and that's enough to build a life on." Winter came hard that year, with snow in the mountains and frost in the valley. The cattle needed extra feed and constant monitoring. The pipes froze twice, requiring Yates to crawl under the house in the bitter cold to thaw them. But through it all, Catherine and Yates worked side by side, their partnership deepening with each shared challenge. They were careful about propriety, mindful of Catherine's reputation. Yates still slept in the bunkhouse, though they spent their evenings together in the main house. They didn't kiss again after that day in the mud, both agreeing to wait until they could do things properly. But the promise hung between them, sweet and certain, a future they were building one day at a time. Christmas came, and Catherine cooked a feast. They ate at the kitchen table with the good china and exchanged simple gifts. She gave him a new coat, warm and well-made, to replace the threadbare one he'd arrived in. He gave her a music box carved from cedar and inlaid with delicate patterns that played a melody that reminded her of Missouri summers. "Where did you get this?" she asked, turning it over in her hands with wonder. "Made it. Been working on it in the evenings in the bunkhouse." She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "You made this for me. Wanted you to have something beautiful, something that was just yours." She kissed him then, unable to help herself, a soft press of lips that tasted of cinnamon and promise. When she pulled back, they were both smiling. "5 more months," she whispered. "I can wait forever if I have to." January turned to February and February to March. The land began to green up with the spring rains, wildflowers dotting the hillsides in riots of color. The cattle grew fat on the new grass, and the calves from fall breeding began to arrive. Catherine and Yates worked dawn to dusk, but it was good work, satisfying work, the kind that left you tired but content. On April 15th, 3 days before the anniversary of Catherine's first wedding, Yates asked her to ride out with him to check on the eastern pasture. It was a beautiful day, warm and clear, the kind of day that made you believe anything was possible. They rode in comfortable silence, Catherine on Thomas's old gelding and Yates on his paint horse, the land spreading out around them like a promise. When they reached the creek that marked the edge of their property, Yates dismounted and helped Catherine down. He led her to a spot beneath a cottonwood tree where wildflowers grew thick and sweet. "Catherine Whitmore," he said, taking both her hands in his. "I don't have much to offer you. No family name or fortune or fancy education. But I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. You make me want to be better, do better, build something that lasts. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to raise children with you and grow old watching the sunset from that porch. Will you marry me?" He pulled a ring from his pocket, simple gold with a small diamond that caught the sunlight. Catherine recognized it as Thomas's mother's ring, the one she'd sold 6 months ago to pay bills. "You bought back my ring," she whispered. "Went all the way to Sacramento to track it down, figured it should stay in the family." Catherine was crying now, happy tears that streamed down her face unchecked. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Yates Quinn, I will marry you." He slipped the ring on her finger and it fit perfectly, like it had always belonged there. Then he kissed her properly, deeply, with all the pent-up longing of months of waiting. Catherine kissed him back, pouring everything she felt into it, every hope and dream and promise. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Placerville, with Yates in his new coat and Catherine in a dress the color of spring sky. The congregation was sparse, many in town still disapproved of their relationship, but the few who came were the ones who mattered. The young couple who ran the general store stood up as witnesses. A few neighboring ranchers attended, men who respected hard work more than gossip. And in the front pew sat an old woman named Martha Crane, who had lost her own husband young and remarried for love, and who told Catherine afterward that she was proud of her for choosing happiness. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with tight-lipped disapproval, but he performed it nonetheless. Catherine spoke her vows clearly, promising to love and honor Yates Quinn all the days of her life. When it was Yates's turn, his voice was strong and sure. "I promise to stand beside you in good times and bad, in plenty and in want. I promise to build a life with you that honors what came before while reaching for what comes next. I promise to love you until the earth stops spinning, and probably long after that too." Catherine laughed through her tears, and then they were kissing, and the small congregation was clapping, and they were running down the aisle hand in hand, racing toward their future. The reception was held at the ranch, a simple affair with music from a fiddle player and food Catherine had prepared over the past week. They danced in the barn as the sun set, Yates holding her close and whispering things that made her blush and laugh. When the last guests finally left, stumbling home in the twilight, Catherine and Yates were finally, properly alone. Their wedding night was everything Catherine had hoped and nothing like she'd experienced before. Where Thomas had been gentle and careful, Yates was passionate and sure. They came together in the bed that Catherine had shared with her first husband, but she felt no guilt, only joy. This was her life now, spinning forward into unknown territory, and she embraced it with her whole heart. The months that followed were the happiest of Catherine's life. She and Yates ran the ranch together as equal partners in work and in love. They expanded the herd, buying good breeding stock with money they'd saved. They planted a vegetable garden behind the house, and Catherine put in flowers too, bright splashes of color that reminded her of her mother. They talked about the future late into the night, making plans and dreaming dreams. In December, Catherine realized she was pregnant. She told Yates on Christmas morning, giving him a tiny knitted bootie she'd made in secret. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at her with wonder written across his face. "We're going to have a baby. Yes, come summer." He kissed her with such tenderness that she cried, and then he was crying too, and they held each other in the winter morning light, marveling at the gift they'd been given. The pregnancy was easier than Catherine's first had been. She carried the baby well, and Yates was attentive to the point of being overprotective, refusing to let her lift anything heavy or work too hard. She chafed at the restrictions but secretly loved the care, the way he treated her like she was precious. In July 1874, Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and difficult, attended by the doctor from Placerville and Martha Crane, who had become a good friend. But when the baby finally arrived, red-faced and squalling, Catherine forgot all the pain in the rush of overwhelming love. "He has your eyes," she told Yates, who was staring at his son with an expression of complete awe. "He has your nose, and your determination from the sound of those lungs." They named him Thomas Yates Quinn, honoring the past and the present both. Catherine had worried that Yates might object to naming their son after her first husband, but he had insisted. "Thomas gave you to me," he'd said simply, "by sending me here, by trusting me with his dream. Our son should carry his name." Baby Thomas was a good baby, quick to smile and slow to fuss. He grew fat and healthy on Catherine's milk, his gray-green eyes watching everything with intense curiosity. Yates was a devoted father, walking the floor with Thomas when he cried at night, changing diapers without complaint, talking to his son about cattle and horses, and the land like the baby could understand every word. The years spun past with the easy rhythm of good seasons. The ranch prospered under their joint management. They added acreage, buying the neighboring property when old Mr. Patterson died and his children wanted nothing to do with ranch life. They built a new barn and expanded the house, adding rooms for the children they hoped would come. Thomas was 2 when his brother arrived, another healthy boy they named Daniel James Quinn. Where Thomas was serious and watchful, Daniel was all mischief and laughter. The boys were different as night and day, but devoted to each other, playing together in the dirt while Catherine worked the garden and Yates mended fences. In the winter of 1878, Catherine gave birth to a daughter, a tiny perfect girl with dark hair and her mother's stubborn chin. They named her Rose Martha Quinn, after both of the flowers Catherine loved and the woman who had stood by them when others had not. Yates cried when he held her for the first time, this little girl who would grow up surrounded by brothers and big sky and parents who loved her fiercely. The town of Placerville slowly came around to accepting the Quinns. It was hard to maintain disapproval in the face of their obvious happiness, their successful ranch, their beautiful children. Mrs. Henderson eventually unbent enough to sell Catherine flour again, though she never quite apologized for the early snubs. Reverend Matthews christened each of their children without comment, though his sermons on propriety grew less pointed. New families moved to town, people who didn't know or care about the scandal of a widow who'd married her hired hand. In the spring of 1880, Martha Crane passed away peacefully in her sleep. Catherine grieved her friend deeply, but took comfort in knowing Martha had lived to see her happy, had held baby Rose and told Catherine she was proud of the life she'd built. At the funeral, Catherine spoke about courage and kindness and the importance of choosing love over judgment. Many in the congregation shifted uncomfortably, but some nodded in agreement. The years continued their steady spin. Thomas grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books and horses in equal measure. Daniel became the ranch's best rider, fearless and skilled, able to gentle any horse no matter how wild. Rose proved to have her father's way with animals and her mother's practical mind, trailing after Yates from the time she could walk, demanding to help with every task. In 1883, Catherine discovered she was pregnant again at 35, a surprise baby that made her feel young and old at the same time. This time she carried a daughter, another dark-haired girl they named Hope Elizabeth Quinn. Hope arrived in early spring, her birth easy after 3 previous children, and she brought with her a sense of completion, like the family was finally whole. 4 children, 40 acres grown to 80, a house full of laughter and love. Catherine sometimes thought about the woman she'd been that summer day in 1872, standing broken and alone watching a widow mill. She thought about Thomas, who she still loved in the way you love memories, with fondness and gratitude. She thought about Yates, riding up her drive with nothing but a paint horse and a promise. She thought about all the moments that had led here, all the choices and chances and risks. One evening in the fall of 1885, when Thomas was 11 and Hope was 2, and the house was finally quiet, Catherine and Yates sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Sierra Nevada in shades of gold and rose. 13 years had passed since that first meeting, and they'd lived through drought and flood, triumph and loss, joy and sorrow. The earth had kept spinning, carrying them along. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked, her hand in his. "Stopping here instead of drifting on?" Yates smiled, the same smile that had made her heart race that first time and still did today. "Not for a single second. Best decision I ever made, riding up this drive, even with 4 children and a mortgage and responsibilities that never end, especially because of those things. Catherine, before I found you, I was just surviving. Now I'm living. There's a difference." She leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the sun sink lower. "The earth won't stop spinning," she said softly. "Then let's spin with it," he replied, like he always did, like he would for the rest of their lives. The Quinn Ranch continued to thrive through the rest of the 1880s and into the 1890s. Thomas grew into a fine young man, inheriting his father's skill with horses and his mother's head for business. When he turned 18 in 1892, he went to agricultural college in Sacramento, the first Quinn to get formal education beyond basic schooling. He wrote home every week, letters full of new ideas about breeding and irrigation that had Yates shaking his head in amused wonder. Daniel had no interest in college. He was a cowboy through and through, happiest in the saddle riding fence line or moving cattle. At 16, he was as good a hand as any man they employed, and Yates trusted him with responsibilities that would have overwhelmed most boys his age. Daniel dreamed of the open range of cattle drives and wild country, but he loved his family's ranch too much to leave for long. He'd ride out for weeks at a time, hiring on with drives or working neighboring spreads, but he always came home. Rose proved to be the best horse breeder in 3 counties. She had an eye for bloodlines and conformation that was almost supernatural, and the patience to work with difficult animals that others would have given up on. At 14, she sold her first trained horse for more money than most men made in a month, and she put every penny into expanding her breeding program. Yates had built her a special barn for her project horses, and she spent more time there than in the house. Hope, the baby, was the family's ray of sunshine. She had Catherine's gift for growing things, and together they expanded the garden until it supplied not just the family but half of Placerville. Hope sold vegetables and flowers at the town market every Saturday, her cheerful personality making her a favorite with customers. In 1894, Thomas came home from college with a degree and a fiancée, a smart young woman named Elizabeth who had studied teaching. They were married in the summer, and Catherine cried happy tears watching her eldest son promise his life to someone else. Thomas and Elizabeth built a house on the southern portion of the ranch, and Elizabeth opened a school that served ranch children from all over the valley. Daniel married in 1896, bringing home a rancher's daughter named Sarah who could ride and rope as well as any man. They took over the northern pastures, running their own herd on Quinn land. At Sunday dinners, the family gathered around a table that had to be expanded twice to accommodate everyone, and Catherine looked around at her children and their spouses and felt her heart might burst with gratitude. Rose showed no interest in marriage, much to the disappointment of several young men in Placerville. She was married to her horses, she said with a laugh, and they were less trouble than husbands and more profitable besides. Catherine worried sometimes that Rose was lonely, but the girl seemed genuinely content with her life, and Catherine had learned long ago that everyone's path looked different. Hope was still young, only 13 in 1896, with years ahead of her before decisions about marriage and future had to be made. She was courted by every boy in town, her sunny nature and pretty face making her popular, but she treated them all with friendly indifference, more interested in her plants than in romance. In 1898, Catherine and Yates celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. Thomas and Daniel organized a party that brought people from all over the valley, ranchers and merchants and farmers and families. The barn was decorated with wildflowers and lanterns, and there was music and dancing and food enough to feed an army, even Mrs. Henderson came, older and frailer now, and she actually smiled at Catherine, the past finally, truly forgotten. That night, after the guests had gone and the children had retreated to their own homes, Catherine and Yates sat on their porch in the spot where they'd sat 1,000 times before. They were older now, graying at the temples and slower in the joints, but still strong, still vital, still deeply in love. 25 years, Catherine said, marveling. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes it feels like forever. Best 25 years of my life, Yates said, pulling her close. Here's to 25 more. We'll be ancient by then. Don't care. I plan to love you when I'm ancient, when I'm toothless and deaf and can't remember my own name, I'll still remember you. She kissed him, tasting time and promise and the future they'd built together. The earth won't stop spinning, she whispered against his lips. Then let's spin with it, he answered, and they did. The years turned like the earth turned, steady and sure. In 1900, Thomas and Elizabeth welcomed their first child, a boy named Matthew, making Catherine and Yates grandparents for the first time. Catherine held her grandson and felt the circle complete, from the broken widow she'd been to the grandmother she'd become. More grandchildren followed, Daniel and Sarah producing 3 strong boys in quick succession, each one a handful and a joy. Rose eventually did marry in 1902 to a horse trader from Oregon who shared her passion for breeding. They merged their programs and built a ranch that became famous across the West for producing the finest working horses in the territory. She remained close to the family, bringing her husband to Sunday dinners and teaching her nieces and nephews about horses the way Yates had taught her. Hope married in 1905 at 22, choosing a young doctor who had come to Placerville to set up practice. They built a house in town, and Hope continued her gardening, now supplying her husband's patients with flowers that brightened sick rooms and vegetables that nourished healing bodies. She gave Catherine and Yates twin granddaughters in 1906, and the chaos of 2 babies at once filled the family with laughter and exhaustion in equal measure. Through it all, the ranch continued. The Quinn name became synonymous with quality cattle and fair dealing. They weathered bad years and good, drought and plenty, loss and triumph. They buried workers who became family and celebrated marriages and births. They modernized when it made sense and held on to tradition when it mattered. They built something that would last, just like they'd promised. In the spring of 1910, Catherine was diagnosed with a weak heart. The doctor, Hope's husband, told her gently that she needed to slow down to let others handle the heavy work. She was 62 years old and she'd lived a full life, but she wasn't ready to stop. Still, she followed orders, spending more time in the garden and less time working cattle, more time with grandchildren and less time riding fence line. Yates, at 63, was still strong, but he followed her lead, letting Thomas and Daniel take over more of the daily operations. They were good men, capable men, ready to carry the ranch into the next generation. It was time, Yates admitted, to step back and enjoy what they'd built. On a warm evening in May 1912, Catherine and Yates sat on their porch as the sun set over the Sierra Nevada. 40 years had passed since Yates had ridden up the drive with nothing but a paint horse and hope, 40 years of love and work and family, 40 years of spinning with the earth. I'm tired, Catherine said softly, her hand in his, but it's a good tired, the tired of a life well lived. The best life, Yates agreed. I wouldn't change a single minute of it. Not even the hard parts, the losses, not even those, they made the good parts sweeter. Catherine looked out at the land they'd built together, at the houses scattered across the property where their children and grandchildren lived. She thought about Thomas, her first husband, who had given her this place and this life. She thought about the broken woman she'd been and the whole woman she'd become. She thought about Yates, the gift she hadn't known she needed, the love she hadn't known she could have again. Thank you, she said, though the words seemed inadequate for everything she felt. For what? For riding up that drive, for staying, for loving me when I'd forgotten how to love myself. Yates lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her fingers gently. Thank you for giving me a reason to stop drifting, for building a life with me. For spinning with the earth when it would have been easier to stand still. They sat in silence as the stars emerged, one by one, in the darkening sky. The earth spun beneath them, carrying them forward as it always had. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear the sounds of family, grandchildren laughing and doors closing and life continuing in its beautiful, ordinary way. Catherine felt a deep peace settle over her. This was what she'd been looking for all those years ago, standing alone and broken after Thomas's death. Not a replacement for what she'd lost, but something new, something better, something entirely her own. She'd found love twice, built a life twice, and both times the earth had kept spinning, carrying her toward joy she hadn't imagined possible. I love you, Yates Quinn, she said into the gathering darkness. I love you too, Catherine Quinn, until the earth stops spinning. And probably long after that, she added, completing the promise he'd made 40 years ago. They sat together as the night deepened, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful from shared grief and hope. The ranch spread out around them, alive with the legacy they'd created. Their children were settled and happy. Their grandchildren were growing strong and bright. The land was prosperous and well-tended. They had done what they set out to do, built something that would outlast them, a monument not to grief but to love, to resilience, to the courage it takes to keep spinning with the earth even when everything tells you to stop. In 1915, Catherine passed away peacefully in her sleep, Yates holding her hand. She was 67 years old, and she died surrounded by family in the house she'd made a home. The funeral was the largest Placerville had ever seen, with people coming from 3 counties to pay their respects to a woman who had been a pillar of the community, a devoted mother, and a testament to the power of love. Yates grieved deeply, as one would expect after losing a partner of 42 years. But he didn't break. He'd learned from Catherine that grief didn't have to destroy you, that it was possible to honor the dead by continuing to live. He remained on the ranch, helping Thomas and Daniel when they needed it, spending time with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, teaching them about the land and the life he and Catherine had built. On quiet evenings, he would sit on the porch in his usual spot and talk to Catherine as if she were still beside him. He'd tell her about the grandchildren's accomplishments, about the ranch's progress, about the garden that Hope maintained in her mother's memory. He'd tell her he missed her, that he was counting the days until they could be together again, that he'd love her until the earth stopped spinning and beyond. Yates Quinn lived to the age of 83, passing away in 1920 surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His last words were a smile and a whisper. I'm coming, Catherine, time to spin together again. They buried him next to Catherine on a hill overlooking the ranch beneath a cottonwood tree planted by Rose. The headstone was simple, Yates Quinn, beloved husband, father, and friend. Below it, carved at Hope's request, were the words that had defined their lives together. Then let's spin with it. The Quinn Ranch continued through generations, passing from Thomas to his children and from them to their children. The story of Catherine and Yates became family legend, told and retold at gatherings. A tale of loss and love, of courage and commitment, of two people who refused to let grief define them and instead chose to build something beautiful. The porch where they'd sat together remained sacred space, a place where family members went to think and dream and remember. And through it all, through the changing times and evolving world, through wars and depressions and progress that would have astounded Catherine and Yates, the ranch stood as testament to what they'd built. Not just land and cattle and buildings, but a legacy of love. A reminder that even in the hardest times, even when everything seems lost, the earth keeps spinning, and the choice is always whether to spin with it or be left behind. They chose to spin. And in doing so, they created something that would outlast them both, a love story written not in words but in the land they'd nurtured, the children they'd raised, and the courage they'd shown in the face of impossible odds. It was a story that began with grief and ended with joy, a story that proved that sometimes the greatest love comes not at the beginning of life but in the middle, when you think your story is over but it's really just beginning. The earth never stopped spinning. But for 42 years, Catherine and Yates Quinn spun with it together, and that made all the difference.